Hey guys, and welcome to an absolute mammoth of a video. I know it's really long, but I've been working on it for quite some time, and I really do hope you enjoy it. And if you do, consider sharing it with your friends and family, hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It really helps out an awful lot more than you might think. Now, to get something straight from the start, the original Hagerty Media video with Jason Cammisa is my all-time favorite Dino video on YouTube. Simply for the fact what it is trying to do is give these cars the honor that they deserve. I have nothing but respect for Jason and his work. So this video is not meant as a takedown. Jason's video is well over 20 minutes long, so let's jump straight into it.
Popular lore has it that Enzo Ferrari considered anything less than a 12-cylinder automobile to be not worthy of the Ferrari badge. So, popular lore deduced that Enzo must have somehow been forced into making a 6-cylinder and then 8-cylinder car, neither of which were good enough for him to put his own name on it. So instead, he made up some less-than name for his less-than cars. Popular lore couldn't possibly be more wrong.
Popular lore certainly gets part of the story wrong, but as we'll see, Jason's narrative also simplifies some elements that deserve a little bit more nuance. For example, Enzo Ferrari had remarkably little involvement in the creation of Dino as a separate brand within the Ferrari family, and he was effectively convinced into it rather than being the driving force behind it. And another party that had even less to do with it than most people think, in other words totally nothing, was Fiat.
Enzo Ferrari's father was named Alfredo, after the fettuccine.
I probably don't need to point this out every time. These aren't inaccuracies, that's just Jason's sense of humor, and I absolutely love it.
Enzo's older brother was also named Alfredo, after his father, obviously. And when Enzo was just 18 years old, he watched both of those Alfredos die from the flu.
Now I know this sounds like nitpicking, but neither Enzo Ferrari's father nor his brother actually died of influenza. Well, they both actually died of serious lung diseases. His father died of pneumonia. Not even a year later, his brother died of pleurisy. But yeah, let's get back to the video.
So many years later, when Enzo had his first child, he named him Alfredo, obviously in celebration of his departed father and brother. And then he watched that little Alfredo, Alfredino, wither and die horrifically from muscular dystrophy when he was just 24 years old. Popular lore needn't have interviewed Enzo Ferrari to understand that there is no higher human form of flattery than naming something after someone you love, or loved and lost. Calling these cars Dino wasn't an insult, it was an honor. And all it takes is spending a couple minutes with these cars instead of popular lore to figure out why they were worthy of the name Dino.
Of course these cars were worthy of the name Dino. However, Enzo Ferrari never named these cars Dino. In his own autobiography, Enzo writes that due to circumstances, these cars were named Dino. And what those circumstances were, we'll get back to as the story unfolds.
Revelations is brought to you by Hagerty Drivers Club, which includes
Even leaving this in.
a fabulous magazine and discounts on your favorite car stuff. There's a link up there. Click on it. Thank you for watching, and now back to my regularly scheduled nonsense. Ow! So much has been written about Enzo Ferrari, but one thing remains remarkably consistent. He was a prickly old son of a bitch, and I think you can understand why. Something else that stays incredibly consistent is that Enzo didn't care about street cars at all. He was in it for the racing. And in the late 1950s, Ferrari was racing using a V6 engine that they called the Dino, named, of course, after Fred Flintstone's adorable little Dogosaurus.
At this point, it's still not the birth of Dino as a car brand within the Ferrari family. This is Enzo's homage to Dino, as this was the engine that he and other engineers had worked on. Now, how that engine designation came to be a car brand is a totally different story, and it's not one that most people think it is.
Dino wasn't just the sickly son of the boss. After studying mechanical engineering, he worked at Ferrari and was particularly interested in engine design. It was Dino who pushed the company to build that V6 for racing, though sadly he never got to hear the engine run. But less than a year after his death, the Dino V6 wasn't just running, it was racing, and it later powered Ferrari's first ever mid-engine race car.
So far, so good. But now things start to diverge a little bit.
It was still racing almost a decade later when a sanctioning body rule change hit. For continued participation in Formula 2, Ferrari had to build 500 road-going versions of that racing engine within 12 months. 500 doesn't sound like that much, but for decades, Ferrari sales volumes looked far more like Bugatti's than today's Ferrari. Building and selling 500 additional cars would almost double the company's annual sales. That presented a serious problem, because it meant Ferrari couldn't go racing. As it turns out, Fiat was looking at working together with Ferrari to produce a new engine for its flagship. Ferrari's pedigree would help Fiat. Fiat and Ferrari working together would help Italy, and slapping a bunch of Dino V6s in a road-going, high-volume Fiat would allow Ferrari to build them in sufficient numbers to keep racing in Formula 2. It was win-win-win. All those extra engines would go into the Fiat Dino Coupe and Spider, and later into the Lancia Stratos. But those are stories for another episode.
So after mentioning Ferrari's first mid-engine race car, the video could have just jumped straight into the next chapter, mid-engine madness, because as it turns out, the Formula 2 homologation had nothing to do with the birth of Dino as a marque.
Meanwhile, there was something else going on in Italy. It was called mid-engine madness. Which is why the kids working at Lamborghini were in such a rush to design the world's first mid-engine road-going supercar.
Without specifying that Jason is actually referring to a production car, one could actually argue that that honor of the first mid-engine road-going supercar actually belongs to one of Mr. Leonardo Fioravanti's earliest Ferrari design projects, the 250 LM Speciale, a road-going version of the 250 LM created for a wealthy American client. That said, yes, the Lamborghini Miura was the first production mid-engine road-going supercar.
Another patient struck by the bug was Sergio Pininfarina,
True.
Who was also pushing Ferrari to make a mid-engine car for the road. Pininfarina, don't forget, had been responsible for the design of just about every Ferrari, and to help persuade Il Commendatore, mounted the Dino V6 right in the middle of a show car.
This is absolutely true, but there is a subtle and important distinction. Mr. Leonardo Fioravanti writes in his book, and I quote, "At Pininfarina, for a long time, we had dreamed of putting a mid-engine Ferrari on sale. It would have allowed for more innovative and captivating aesthetics, greater aerodynamic efficiency, and, above all, it would have put us on the same path already taken by some of our competitors. And some important technicians from Maranello agreed with our idea, and together we studied how to convince Il Commendatore." End of quote. In some interviews, this internal effort was jokingly referred to as the Dino Rebellion, which I really find a cool name for it. So, how did the Dino engine become a car brand? Was it Fiat and the Formula 2 homologation? Mr. Fioravanti continues to explain their plan to convince Il Commendatore, who is famously opposed to a mid-engine road-going Ferrari, and I quote again, Perhaps a car conceived, designed and built by Ferrari, but without the prancing horse badge, would have made the decision easier. After all, abandoning such a highly successful formula would have been too bold in the eyes of the many clients who were waiting for a mid-engine model. For this reason, the idea was to base the project on a racing chassis and engine carrying the Dino designation. Components that would be used to build a show prototype. In particular, we started from the beautiful 206P, designed at Ferrari, and Aldo Braverone shaped it into a very innovative, inspired and original design.
With styling cues taken straight from Ferrari's mid-engine race cars.
Interestingly, the project had a very specific aim not to look too much like a Ferrari. And that's why Mr. Fioravanti introduced elements like the nose light bar to avoid traditional Ferrari cues.
The Dino Berlinetta Speciale was a non-running showpiece, but was received with enough excitement that Enzo
There's the nose bar, the lights.
And a year later, at the 1966 Turin Auto Show, Pininfarina presented its nearly production-ready design.
When I later asked Mr. Fioravanti directly whether the Dino mark arose independently from the Fiat Formula 2 homologation project, he simply answered, "Si." In other words, the Fiat Ferrari Formula 2 homologation project was not what led to Dino becoming a separate car brand. Dino arose from a semi-secret internal project aimed at convincing Enzo Ferrari to approve a mid-engine road car.
It made a stir, but Enzo had a problem with it. The engine was mounted longitudinally, and that was never going to work for two reasons. First of all, that magnificent new Mura had its V12 mounted transversely, and Enzo Ferrari was not about to let Ferruccio Lamborghini win the sideways engine game, even though history would show that that was the wrong game to play. Secondly, Enzo felt that his entry-level sports car should have a lot more cargo space, and mounting the engine transversely would fix that. And boy, did it work.
Get it.
Of course, that change meant an all-new transmission design, and it's the craziest thing this side of Olive Garden pouring cream all over noodles and calling it fettuccine Alfredo. Hello? Alfredo is made with butter, no cream. That's sacrilege.
So true. Butter, Parmigiano and pasta water. That's it. And there is another reason why the engine eventually was mounted transversely. Mr. Fioravanti explains that him and Aldo Braverone were dissatisfied with the long drooping tail of the longitudinal prototype, the second one. And when they expressed a desire to improve the car's proportions, Enzo Ferrari, already motivated by all the reasons that Jason has just mentioned, tasked Angelo Billet to look at a transverse solution, and that really improved the overall car's proportion. So
Anyway, the engine's power comes out of the crankshaft like this, through the clutch, and then drops down using a series of 3 spur gears to the input shaft, into the transmission, which is located parallel to and underneath the engine. Untraditional, but it worked great, just like Olive Garden's food. Though afterwards, Enzo asked for separate lids for the trunk and engine, lest he be forced to see his son's signature every time he opened the trunk.
this anecdote is often repeated, but I'm not 100% sure of that. I mean, it's clear to see technically why or what the benefits are of having 2 separate lids. But something else that always stood out to me was that you still see his signature on the back of the car, where it's much more prominent. I don't get it. I don't get the quote, and I'm not 100% sure whether Enzo would have actually said this, but it could be true. But I have my doubts.
Trunk. For the record, the Dino script was Alfredino's own signature.
Yeah.
The transverse engine production car made its debut a year later and was called the Dino 206 GT. 2.0 for the engine size, 2.0 liters, and 6 for its cylinder count. Its construction was simple. It used a tube frame to which aluminum body panels were riveted. In addition to being Ferrari's first mid-engine road car...
So yeah, let's address this here now. According to Enzo Ferrari himself, the honor of Ferrari's first mid-engine road car goes to the 365 GT4 BB, not to the Dino. And this decision also contributed to the initial delay of the 308 GTB, but more on that in a little bit.
And its first road-going V6. This was the first Ferrari to use rack and pinion steering. Its suspension was double wishbones at all four corners, and it had four-wheel disc brakes, meaning this was race car stuff for the road, and it was an immediate phenomenon. Rarely can a car born in the heat of competition have been so successfully adapted to road use, said Car Magazine. The 206 Dino stands out as one of the most advanced grand touring cars of our time. Paul Frere, the Formula One driver and very talented journalist, called the 206
also a Belgian dude, don't hold that against him.
And since this show is called Revelations, plural, here's another one. Paul Frere is the guy who popularized the quote from Enzo about a Ferrari needing to have 12 cylinders and anything less than 12 being less than a Ferrari. There's a big problem with that quote, though, because by then, Ferrari had already made 4 cylinders, straight sixes, V6s of 60, 65, and 120 degrees, straight 8s, and V8s, in addition to the V12s and flat 12s. Enzo Ferrari didn't seem to give a flaming piston skirt what the engine layout was, so long as he was winning. And there's your revelation.
So yeah, until recently I thought exactly the same thing, and I actually made a video of it as well, which I should now go and correct. But no, actually Paul Frere was right. Enzo Ferrari did not like his road cars to have anything less than 12 cylinders. Now, Enzo Ferrari wasn't only a prickly old son of a bitch, he was also a very complex person, and he treated his race cars totally different than his road cars. When it came to racing, he indeed didn't give a flaming piston skirt about what the engine layout was, as long as it meant he could win. It gave him the image, the heritage, whatever he wanted. But in his road cars, there is no winning as such. So to bring all that other kind of stuff, the heritage, the image and stuff like that, he wanted his road cars to have nothing less than 12 cylinders, because it gave him all of that. And all of that really became clear when I was reading Mr. Leonardo Fioravanti's book, in which he describes his relationship with Enzo Ferrari and his opinion, Enzo Ferrari's opinion on things. So yeah, Enzo Ferrari did not want anything less than a 12-cylinder in his road cars. Until Dino opened that door for him. And that's why I can get really frustrated when I hear people say that Dinos are lesser Ferraris. They defined Ferrari's future and made other cars like the 288 GTO and the F40 possible. Were they lesser Ferraris? Dino is the father of most Ferraris that people idolize today. And that's even more so true for the ugly duckling, the GT4, than it is for the drop-dead gorgeous Saxon wheels like 246 GT.
And by the way, the little mid-engine Ferrari was definitely winning. It wasn't just fast and perfectly balanced in handling. It was also a different kind of Ferrari, one that was attractive to young people. And the star of that show? Well, it was the V6. The 2-liter made 180 horsepower and revved to an astronomical 8,000 RPM. Its cylinder banks were splayed out at 65 degrees versus the more conventional 60, just to make more room for a straight intake tract, despite the enormous width of those twin-cam heads. The crank pins were offset accordingly to give a perfectly even firing order, and the exhausts were completely equal in length, difficult to do when one bank is further forward than the other. And the result of all of that was some of the most incredible music to ever come from any engine of any configuration. The Dino was quick, too, but there was a Beetle-shaped problem. In its top-spec trim, the pesky Porsche 911S was even quicker. So after building just 150 or so Dinos, Ferrari hit the 206 with the displacement stick. Not to be confused with a delicious Olive Garden breadstick. The show is not sponsored in any way by Olive Garden, that we know of. The motor was punched out to 2.4 liters, giving us the 246 GT. A little wheelbase stretch gave us some more stability. And since the Formula 2 homologation requirements had been satisfied, Ferrari could save some money by casting the engine block out of iron instead of aluminum, and also welding steel body panels to the frame instead of those earlier riveted aluminum pieces. The 2.4 was torquier, and the extra weight didn't slow the Dino down. It could still hit 60 miles an hour in under 7 seconds and cruise at $145. Those were serious numbers in the day, though not quite world records. Those were busy being broken by the Lamborghini Miura, which was vastly more powerful and a lot more expensive. The Dino needed to rely on its handling to set records, and that's what it did. It recorded the highest skid pad grip that Motor Trend magazine had ever seen. And even though the Dino's Dino V6 was a racing unit, the Dino itself didn't actually race all that often, except for one, a white one, that flat out won the 1975 Cannonball Baker Sea to Shining Sea Memorial Trophy Dash, known to you and me as the Cannonball Run.
I'm not entirely sure what criteria Jason had for saying that they didn't race all that often, except for one. When I looked into it, what I've been able to verify is that the Dino 246 GT was entered in at least 16 official race events. If we exclude the entries where the car was registered but didn't actually arrive, that still leaves 11 events where the GT4 actually appeared at a race weekend, including several where it was classified in the results. It never outright won a race, but in 1972, the North American racing team actually entered the 246 GT in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, where it finished a very respectable 17th place and second overall in its class. The class win went to that pesky Porsche 911S, which finished 13th overall, so the Dino wasn't exactly miles off. But back to the white Dino in the Cannonball Run.
Owner and racer Jack May and his buddy Rick Klein competed the 2,951-mile run in 35 hours and 53 minutes, averaging 83 miles an hour and beating the previous record set by Dan Gurney in a Ferrari Daytona by 1 minute. This despite getting arrested in Ohio, felling a spark plug trying not to speed with cops on their asses for an hour in Kansas, hitting 3 jackrabbits at 140 miles an hour in Arizona, punching through a sandstorm, and then getting lost in LA. God bless America. America, as it turns out, was a huge market for the Dino. It was a success everywhere, but a particular sensation in the US, especially in targa-topped GTS form. So, when it came time to replace the 246, common sense would have dictated that Ferrari would have focused on the US market and perhaps made another beautiful little two-seater with a convertible from the get-go. Well, it turns out common sense is just as accurate as popular lore, because instead, Ferrari did the opposite.
This one surprised me to see in this video, even when the video first came out. The Dino 308 GT4 is not a successor for the 246 GT. That would have been the 308 GTB, whose design work started in early 1969. Now, let that sink in for a second. Which was inspired by Mr. Fioravanti's own P6 project, which in turn had design cues from the 246 GT. Now, why the 308 GTB came out that much later than the 308 GT4 is enough stuff for a whole separate video, and if you want to see that one, please comment in the comment section below and I might one day get that video made. But in other words, the Dino 308 GT4 was an expansion of the offering within the Dino marque, and was an addition to the two-seater offering, not a successor.
The Dino 308 GT4 nearly incited riots. For 1975, it was the only Ferrari sold in America, and not only did it not have a single Ferrari badge on its exterior, it was, ugly. Their words, not mine. To say the automotive world was stunned would be an understatement, because they were stunned 3 times. First, by how the 308 looked. If the old Dino had been a curvaceous, sumptuous 1960s beauty allowed to age gracefully into the 1970s, well then this was an angular, severe 1970s look at a 1980s wedge. It also looked uncomfortably like a 2-year-old Lamborghini, and specifically the Lamborghini Urraco, which is because both cars were designed by Marcello Gandini at Bertone.
Yeah, there is a strong case to be met for that. However, when I discussed this with Mr. Gianbeppi Panico, he described the cars as sisters, born of the same designer, a very similar design brief, and the same era. Having said that, if you look at the 2 prototypes that were shown to Lamborghini and the one that Lamborghini rejected, you can understand why Ferrari had a sour taste with the whole thing after they found out. Then again, I don't understand why Lamborghini went with the design that they ended up going with. I actually thought that the other design was the much more beautiful car, and maybe Gandini thought the same thing, and maybe he just didn't want a good design to be lost in time, and offered it to Ferrari with slight tweaks once they asked for a very similar design brief. But we'll never know for sure. I am working on a visit to the State Archives in Rome, where they're keeping the Bertone files, and maybe one day we will find out. So stay tuned on that one. The world was stunned a second time by the 308's packaging. In a body just 2 inches longer than the 246's, Gandini had managed to stuff in a 90-degree V8 where a 65-degree V6 had barely fit. And he still had room left over for a back seat. But the third shock was the biggest shock of them all. And that was that the 308 was just as good to drive as the original Dino. First and foremost, the praise came from the engine. And still very beautiful. Strategy 308 meant a 3.0-liter V8, and this one wasn't. But it was a 2.9-liter, and it hauled absolute ass. 4 of them, in fact, each one with a seatbelt. There were a few comments in the press about how it didn't sound like a V8 and instead sounded like a Lotus 4-cylinder. This is hilarious. This is the first modern flat plane crankshaft V8, the engine that we associate most with Ferrari today. But back then, they didn't know what to make of all that strange noise. What does it mean? Well, it means revs, revs, and more revs. This thing pulled to 7,700 RPM, and it made more than just weird noises. It made power, 255 horsepower, which is the Italian measurement for horsepower. That largely has nothing to do with actual horsepower. That firepower, in a body that weighed only 250 pounds more than the 246's, meant even more speed. At a time in the emissions-choked mid-1970s when everything else was getting slower by the second. 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds, mid-14s through the quarter, and everyone seemed to agree that it felt even faster because the V8 had insane torque from idle to redline. I really do have to try the 0 to 60 and the quarter mile in Alfredo once the engine and everything is sorted, and see what I can get out of a 51-year-old car. Unlike the Cammisa V6, with which it shared nothing. I am so sick of reading incorrect drivel on the internet. Look, the 65-degree Dino V6 was its own thing. This V8 was a development of the 4-cam highest output version of the Colombo V12 from the Daytona
down to its identical bore and stroke, except this made even more power per cylinder. Everything other than the engine, though, was similar to the smaller Dino. Same wacky boomerang transmission design, similar frame and construction, identical brakes, steering, and suspension, just with an 8-inch wheelbase stretch that gave the car its other defining characteristic: a ride so smooth it could shame a Rolls-Royce engineer. Out of the gate, the praise was off the charts, and over time it got better and better as people got used to this new shape and stopped thinking of this as Gen 2 of Dino 246.
That the GT4 was so good to drive was even confirmed by its biggest critic. In his book, Mr. Fioravanti writes about the shock of Ferrari giving the design task to their biggest crosstown rivals, and he's not complimentary of the design at all, pointing to the Lamborghini Huracan as well, as we've already mentioned. And when Ferrari asked Pininfarina to design a follow-up mid-engine 2+2, their reaction was negative. So in order to collect further arguments and back up the ones that they already had, Mr. Fioravanti asks for a Dino 308 GT4 in the hopes to find valid reasons to say no. After having extensively tested the car with his family, he writes, and I quote, "It felt like a go-kart with very good forward visibility, and the precision and immediacy of the steering completed the picture. Fully loaded, the car would squat down, but the feeling of safety was still up to standards of a sports car. How could one give a negative judgment? Impossible." End of quote. If there ever was any bigger praise for the 308 GT4, I have never seen it. This was from the designer, the engineer designer that set out to critique the car, but just couldn't.
The 308 sold really well, but one problem remained. The only Ferrari ever designed by Bertone just didn't look like a Ferrari. That particular issue was solved a few years later when the GT4's engine and mechanical bits found their way back into a Pininfarina designed body, the jaw-droppingly gorgeous 308 GTB.
That it was jaw-dropping is very obvious and true. But what is lesser well known, and as I already pointed out, is that Mr. Fioravanti started designing or started working on the 308 GTB in 1969. That's before the 308 GT4. So Mr. Fioravanti started working on a follow-up for the 246 GT in early 1969. And as Mr. Fioravanti writes in his own book, and I quote, "My first sketches dated back to early 1969 and were inspired by the P6. Already in the spring of that year, the new code 308 appeared. The successor to the Dino would therefore have had a V8 engine." End of quote. This was before Bertone was approached for a 2+2 design. But then Mr. Fioravanti writes, and I quote again, "But at the end of '69, Ferrari informed us of its intention to produce a Super Berlinetta to present in '71, and the 308 was set aside for the moment." End of quote. Meaning that at the time, the 308 GTB was still considered a Dino follow-up. Also in that same time frame, Ferrari approached Bertone for the 2+2, which would also use that same engine, which at the moment is still in development. By the way, that Super Berlinetta is of course the 365 GT4 BB, which Enzo gave the honor to of being the first Ferrari mid-engine road car. And of course that had to be done with a V12 engine, because yes, even at that time, Enzo still insisted that a Ferrari had a 12-cylinder engine.
Which was the first in the line of mid-engine flat-plane crank V8-powered two-seat sports cars that have defined Ferrari since. So if you define a Ferrari by its engine, as Enzo would have, the first chapter of the Ferrari road car was the V12. And the second chapter was unquestionably that of the flat-plane crank V8. That chapter began here. If instead you see Ferrari as defined by its car's shapes, as many customers do, its first chapter was the front-engine GT. Its second chapter was unquestionably the mid-engine sports car. And that started here.
The Dino marque was literally born out of a semi-secret project to convince Il Commendatore that a mid-engine road-going car was needed in the Ferrari family. And the impact on Ferrari's history just cannot be overstated. These cars are so important for Ferrari.
Which means that no matter how you look at Ferrari, its second generation of road cars was spurred on by and then named after Enzo's own second generation. When Enzo Ferrari found out he was going to have a baby, he quit his racing career forever. This to help ensure that his son wouldn't grow up with a dead father. Instead, Enzo had to grow old with a dead son. He never stopped mourning Dino. He wore a black necktie, dark sunglasses, and visited his son's gravesite every day. I never thought a son could leave his father a legacy, but my son did. And here, popular lore told you these cars were named because they were less than, when instead they were a legacy. Be careful what you learn on the internet. Aren't you on the internet? Yeah. Oh, and while we're on that subject, Alfredo Ferrari was absolutely not named after Fettuccine Alfredo. He was named after Fettuccine Alfredino, the smaller lunch-sized portion. See what I mean?
I'm leaving the end in as well because you just have to listen to the engines. It's just music. Better than music. Lovely. So question guys, V6 sound or V8 sound? What do you think? I love the V6. Not a V8. Oh, it sounds gorgeous as well. I can't wait to drive Alfredo like this. I really can't. I'm taking Alfredo on a trip to Ireland once I have the engine and everything sorted. There's loads of little roads like that, and I know a really particular one that I used to drive on. Fantastic. So yeah, although there are a few inaccuracies in Jason's video, overall I want to do the exact same thing as Jason, and that is to give these cars the honor that they deserve. And then especially the GT4. Once dismissed as the ugly sibling, the GT4 is finally finding the respect that it has always deserved. Its design was controversial at the time, to say the least, but it has aged beautifully. Its interior is genuinely excellent, its ride comfort is surprising, and its engineering deeply important to Ferrari's history. This isn't a lesser Ferrari. It's one of Ferrari's most consequential cars. This is truly one of the last rough diamonds in the Ferrari family. I hope you guys liked the video. I know it was super long. If you're still here, comment in the comment section because that would mean so much to me. And thank you for watching it, guys, and hopefully see you in the next video. Bye.